joining us for our roundtable session. You might say this is the dialogical session, and I really do hope that this will be an opportunity for a genuine transdisciplinary exchange. My name is Dr. Peter Doran from the School of Law. I guess the area where my work connects with a lot of what we've talked about today is around the attention economy. I would describe that as the attention economy is where our conversation about radical reimaginings encounter the contemporary nature of power, the neoliberal nature of power, where we are experiencing the acceleration of technologically supported colonizations of our time, attention, and embodied energy. So the South Korean writer Chung Han talks about talks about depression as and tiredness and exhaustion as one of the tropes of our time, and of course that has deep implications for our attempts to interrupt the dominant imaginary and work for a new one. I've summarized some of the emerging themes, and I'll just go through that short list before I introduce the panel. We've touched on the relationship between power, knowledge, and science, which are intrinsic and core to the European narrative. It's been around since the 15th century. And these are co-constitutive. We can't talk about one without the other, and that's the beauty of a transdisciplinary discussion, because we must be open to a critique of science as narrative, that one-worlding process that is associated with the imposition of a European worldview. We've touched on neoliberalism, which has forcefully embedded itself within our institutions. We've talked about its embeddedness within our education through tropes like competitiveness, the all-critical teaching of economics. And we've talked about the ways in which the neoliberal system reproduces itself maybe most powerfully through the financial system, financialization, which now subjects the material world to its own logic and incorporates and encloses labour and nature in its own systems of logic. And we've talked about the need to repoliticize these spaces, these activities and understandings. We've talked about communities, communities as places of reconfiguring change, and the need to take a complex and layered understanding approach to community, especially here in the north of Ireland, and the importance of extending notions around critical pedagogy to our transformation and transition to a new social, ecological imaginary. So those are some of their very rich discussions. I'm sure there are others that I've not touched upon, but let's hope that we can begin to even go further in examining some of those issues during the session, the roundtable. So I'd like to invite and welcome the members of the panel, Professor John Doran, Director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action, our host organisation. John, would you like to take this? Professor Gary Boyd, he's a Professor of Architecture here at the University. Senior Lecturer Ali FitzGibbon from the School of Arts, English and Languages. And Nuala Flood, who's a Senior Lecturer in Architecture here at Queen's. And in the course of the short presentations that each speaker has been asked to make, maybe they will say a little bit more about themselves and what drives their work. So I don't know if you've decided among yourselves who's going to go first. Shall we start with Ali?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much.
Peter.
you could get to leave again. I don't have to go.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't think we'd like quite walk back in.
I think you're on the wrong side of the page.
Read into that what you
I did this deliberately just to highlight your yeah, a special welcome to our keynote speaker who's going to join the panel. You have to forgive me about the pronunciation. Imre Zeman, is that right? From the University Research Chair and Professor of Communication Arts at the University of Waterloo. We very much look forward to your participation.
If what I'm going to say is kind of maybe a little bit out of step then with what was discussed this morning, it's because I didn't get a chance to hear what was being said. But I come to this as a lecturer in arts management and cultural policy, which is kind of the way in which we think about the business and power and authority in the arts and cultural sphere. But I also come to this with a viewpoint of being a pracademic. It's what I was told I was a number of years ago, which is that my academic life started in about 2015, but before that I spent about 25 years working as an events producer and programmer of international festivals and working in youth arts and consultancy and stuff like that. So I researched the ethics of decision-making in arts and cultural industries management and also cultural labour. So hopefully what I'm going to say fits in with that. So what I'm interested in is seeing how individuals and organisations work in culture from within it and also from a distance. So what I'd like to talk about in relation to this theme of culture and decarbonisation is focused on the cultural economy, the set of interdependent companies and charities and groups and individuals who make and consume art and culture in all its forms. And that includes paid work and also unpaid, but probably because I'm interested in cultural labour, I'm interested in those whose livelihoods derive from cultural practice. So art, theatre, music, film, digital media, socially engaged arts, and the industries and networks that grew up around them. And so in response to the provocation we were given, I suppose I would give a number of kind of thoughts, just points that I hope we can kind of bring kind of to a discussion. And the first is that we have to see culture, or arts and culture, from where I'm coming from, as something more than a driver for a decarbonising message. So very often when I come to these conversations, and John and I have had a number of discussions about this, and anybody who heard me contribute to his COP26 event will have heard me saying the same thing. The arts is not the messenger for the green agenda, it is not the vehicle after these things have been decided and discussed and debated. And I wouldn't be working in research if I didn't believe it had power to communicate messages and deliver exchange of ideas. But I kind of think it has to be slightly more than a courier service. It has to become part of solution finding. And I'm delighted to see that Gawain is going to be here later to talk about ways artists are involved in finding solutions. Which brings me to my second point. Because I look at ethics in arts and cultural industries, I'm kind of interested in how can culture be an honest broker in being part of finding solutions when itself it has such a problem with carbon consumption. And my feeling, or what I'm going to kind of suggest, is that we need to find ways of kind of looking at decarbonised cultural exchange, but it's not that straightforward. So when we think of what decarbonisation might look like in arts and cultural sphere, we can imagine that we can look for new technologies so that the ceramics kilns that ceramic artists use can be fired to the temperatures needed without use of fossil fuels. Or maybe we can think about theatre productions and concerts becoming more localised so that they have no need for travel. Artists and musicians stay in their own regions. They work there to limit their consumption of the world's resources. We can talk about reuse of staging materials. We can talk about the slow festival movements that arose over the last number of years, which is similar to the slow food movement, which is that instead of actually dropping in, doing your concert and leaving, the artists stay in town, they exchange, they have some part of a discourse, they stay for longer. We can rethink our use of our reliance on digital media, streaming and storage, which by its nature exploits natural resources. However, the barriers to this are that the massive economy of mixed practices is not a single entity. So, unlike the kind of sense of kind of large corporations delivering change, most of the arts and cultural sector, bar a couple of major streaming giants, are small to medium enterprises and individuals. And so there's no element that does not encounter, there's no element that encounters decarbonisation in the same way. What a music label in London can do is completely different from a music label in Lagos. The art markets and galleries of the world, major ones, New York, or if we look at the galleries of Bilbao and Venice, they can adopt green practices, but it doesn't divest them of their reliance on the wealth generated from fossil fuel mineral extraction, which in itself buys the art and sustains the art market. And particularly, it is sustained from the exploitation of those sources in colonised countries of the non-West. So we start talking about reparations. How can we separate decarbonisation from the discussion of imperialism? These big players cannot also be the market leaders. We tend to talk about corporations being the global adopters that they then disseminate practice, but they can't be, because the way in which they're constructed are not larger versions of the small, independent, cooperative galleries tucked away in our towns and cities that we most often encounter. Further barriers, the lack of autonomy. We're looking at, in the cultural economy, an entirely interdependent system. The individual ceramic artist cannot solve the technology challenge of a decarbonised kiln, nor are they likely to be able to afford to buy one on their own. Musicians are reliant on venues. Venues are reliant on technicians and equipment hire companies. Venues are reliant on each other to share out the costs of the artists. The list goes on. Governments impose different regulations and expectations, provide different levels of support, and this can make it impossible to earn a livelihood without working across regions and borders. How then do we stop artists from travelling? This is either because the business model has been built like that, say within the festivals or music touring industry, or because the status you need to get subvention like sponsorship or government support requires you to be on an international circuit to be seen as having the correct status. So decarbonisation is about the policy environment, but not always in a direct way and not always as an autonomous act. My third point is, how do we take steps to decarbonise a culture without dismantling its fragile sustainability? As I said, I researched cultural labour. And the value of exchange that's embedded within cultural practices, we need actually to use arts and culture to come together, to share problems, to discuss solutions. When Coldplay announced their somewhat flawed grand gesture plans to only tour if they could be carbon neutral, it also reduced the potential work for every single member of their regular road crew and all the other crews, the box office staff, the promotions crew, the hospitality crew, the stewards in the venues, all lost work. Magnify this to thousands of bands, shows, exhibitions, tours, festivals, venues across the world, and think of what is lost, what exchange is lost, but also what workforce is displaced. Did it actually decarbonise, or did it just make people travel further for less and less work of less and less value? We saw and are seeing the outworkings of COVID-19, and while it reduced carbon consumption, it also led to mass exit of a skilled workforce that is now increasing the mobility of those workforces. If anybody was watching Northern Ireland Screen, and they're suggesting that there weren't enough people left to work in the film industry in Northern Ireland, that is an example. So what is the ethics of care that needs to be applied to these decisions? And how do we decarbonise in a sustainable and ethical way? There are many individual projects, because I was asked to make suggestions of things I had seen. There are many individual projects, pledges, sites that I have seen. Creating Carbon in Scotland is an example, Julie's Bicycle, the Green Arts Initiative spearheaded by Sheen Satira in Tralee. But I suppose in finishing, I would propose that in the cultural economy, there is no one organisation or individual or government that can act alone to decarbonise. Only a collective response and engagement in shared solution finding and an ethics of care, as put forward by the Care Collective, can mitigate the other impacts it will generate. And then I think we can see sustainable cultural exchange and the kind of driving power we look for. Thank you.
I invite Nuala.
So thank you very much for inviting me here today. I have to say I'm not quite as prepared as Ali in this presentation. It's the end of year and we're looking after a lot of marking. But just to give you a little bit of background about me and what we are at in the School of Architecture. So I'm an architect by practice, and I've worked in the area of sustainable design for a number of years before becoming an academic. And I guess just to say, when you're an architect working in the area of sustainable design, oftentimes that's focused around issues of energy efficiency, and it's in that way that we're often connected to the decarbonisation agenda. But actually, when you're working in the School of Architecture, we operate more as a kind of culture, and it's kind of in that way that we've been addressing, I guess, decarbonisation for the past 3 years. So under the leadership of Dr. Sarah Lappin, who's in the audience, we declared a climate emergency back in 2019. And the way we've addressed kind of the climate emergency is much broader than just energy efficiency and efficient resource use. I guess we've looked at it in a much more kind of holistic way. And so I guess we've looked at it in many different ways, and we've looked at it as a culture and as a culture of practice. And I think that is, I think it's kind of how I would think about the link between culture, decarbonisation, and the Architecture School of Queen's. Sorry, I wasn't quite as prepared as Ali for this presentation.
That's just my habit of talking.
So I hope I can add to the debate there today. Okay, thank you.
Can I invite Gary?
Thank you very much. I've got slides actually. I'll leave it to you.
You know, Tracy, you should sit up here.
Thanks very much. It was great that Hiroki wrote High Carbon Past, because that's what I'm going to talk about. This is my first day back actually. I've been off on extended fellowship for some time, and so I'm an architect and a historian, so I talk about the recent past quite often as a means of kind of understanding maybe where the future is going to go and trying to take those issues forward. So carbon controversies, I mean, and I've been writing a book about architecture and coal mining. Now I'm going to give a caveat here, this is not Trumpian kind of call for coal mining. Coal mining belongs in the past. Absolutely, there should be no more coal mining ever. Having said that, there's a lot of really interesting and paradoxical things that go on, especially in Great British coal mining in the 20th century, that you should probably be aware of. That's my argument. So the coal mining thing came from reading books like this, and looking at, for example, the very famous Carbon Democracy by Timothy Mitchell, and also Carbon Nature by Bob Johnston. And this idea that somehow the use of carbon concentrated power within sections of the working class has somehow ushered in an idea of democracy. There's also fossil capital there. And then in the middle is the book that was co-edited by Imre and Dominic Boyer. And it was one of Imre's kind of suggestions that I thought was really, really interesting. He said that, like, in the West at least, you have a situation where you cannot discern where the oil scape begins or ends. You know, it's all just everything. You know, we don't have to deal with the pollution either in a very visceral way, the way you have to do it in the developing world. And I thought that was really interesting, and he suggested that one has to look for controversies. You have to go out and actively engage with the extremes, and actively engage with the places where oil is produced to find that. And I thought that's really interesting, because these are obviously geographical extremities, but there's also historical extremities, and there's also this idea of the notion of coal mining. So coal mining in Britain, and this is Bill Brandt's very famous photograph of a miner at his dinner in County Northumbria. But what it says, there's 2 points about this I'd like to make. One, the figure of the miner was in everybody's purview. Everybody knew about miners. And the second thing was that coal as a substance was also in your face all the time. You couldn't get away from coal. Every house that you were in had this kind of dealings with coal. You knew the price of it, you knew the size of it, you knew how much you were using, which I think is a really interesting thing to consider. You were very, very aware of what it was. You're also aware of the polluted environments that it gave. The ash in your fireplace, the smoke in your house, the pollution in the city. These were all there. They were all there in the 1930s when this photograph was taken. They were also there in the 1960s after you'd made it, and you have a bottle of martini on your mantelpiece, and you're kind of having a snuggle with your significant other, and you're burning coal through a coal master. So these people, and then in the 1960s, also knew this idea of what coal was and where it was. And, so it was there, viscerally present in their everyday lives, in a way that arguably oil just isn't, because oil can be displaced, which is what happens. I mean, and this reminded me of this quotation, or this section of Capital, which is the fetish of commodities and the secret thereof, where Marx talks about the disappearance of how things are made through mass production. You no longer have a sense of how things are created, produced, which made me think I need to think about how coal was produced, and this idea of, we saw an image earlier on of Carola Hines' book, The Oilscape. But my argument was, before the oilscape we had the coalscape. So this was kind of ongoing explorations into the idea of the coalscape. Again, this idea that was everywhere. These were these towers from this indigenous workforce were in Wales. I was going to show some slides from my hometown where we had kind of not quite as nice architecturally as those ones, but we had towers as well. It was there was a coal mining magazine. There was a coal mining, if you went to the cinema in the 1950s until the 1980s, bizarrely enough, you would see quite often a short film about coal mining as part of the programme. It was just an incredible presence in everyday life. Coal mining communities were made. This is in Kent. I don't know if you can see, but the kind of roundy kind of, it's this very strange plan by Patrick Abercrombie, but the kind of roundy form of the townscape, if you like, is actually meant to replicate the headgear of a coal mine, kind of flattened horizontally. Not a great joke, but that's what he did. And then there's also this, and it's an idea, I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to say about this is there's an idea within coal mining, the paradoxes, the horrific, the controversies were in your face all the time, the accidents, the deaths, we knew about them, we knew they were always happening, we knew about the illnesses, we knew about the silicosis and the emphysema, etc. And there was a response to this. There was a response to this from the working people themselves and their communities and the female members of their communities as well. But there's also a response to this because coal mining was so central to our environment. There's also a response by the state. So this is a building designed by the Miners Welfare Committee Architects Department, which is what the book is about that I've just written. And it's pithead baths. It's areas where workers could be cleaned, and there's a huge movement, over 600 of those buildings, quite often, serving up to 1,000 workers. There was 1 million coal miners in Britain in 1913. That's one-tenth of the, basically with their families' independence, 1/10 of the population was involved in coal mining. It's unbelievable. And then all that disappeared and was offshored almost overnight. And Margaret Thatcher paid for the redundancies and the dole of those workers with North Sea oil funds. Isn't that unbelievable? So that's all gone. But with it has gone this idea of this social cohesion that came as kind of, I know there's no environmental justice within this, but there was a kind of sense of social justice and a redistribution of wealth and facilities towards these people who produce coal. So I think that idea of looking at coal and this idea of the coalscape is endlessly fascinating to me. So I end on this idea of, from Roland Barthes, the great French semiologist, etc. So he says that the idea of myth, the idea that what we look at is a myth, because we never see how things are made. We can't perceive that in everyday life. But the idea of the myth, the language of man as a producer, whenever he speaks in order to sorry about the gendered language, in order to transform reality and no longer to preserve it as an image. Wherever he links his language to the making of things, myth is impossible. So I'd just like to leave it there. Thank you.
Now for something completely different. For me, I'm going to offer a kind of loose understanding of culture, which is everything from the mobilization of desire. And for me, that is an extremely important element of our discussion, not least in terms of the comments I made at the introduction, to present a post-carbon, post-growth, post-capitalist future as an economy of abundance, of sensuality, of desire, of joy. And that's not the language that's often used when you hear these debates. It's the apocalypse. It's what we're losing, rather than what it is we can gain. So for me, I'm viewing culture as a way of channeling desire. And I think it's something that's been mobilized in the debates around, the post-carbon transition. I don't think culture, even in that sense, is necessarily going to be positive on the side of decarbonisation and climate resilience. There are petrocultures. We do live in a society in Northern Ireland, notwithstanding its sectarian divisions, a very petrol-head culture. The celebration of internal, combustion engines and road racing and so on. And part of me feels sad saying that, because you feel like a miserable person denying people carbon-based joy and expression. So I think there's no way around the contradiction that we face in introducing desire and culture into either carbon or post-carbon subjectivities and indeed ways of viewing the good life. I also think there is an important element, and indeed, we had a discussion just now, of the subjectivities and the pride. I mean, coal mining communities were not just economic, they were also deeply cultural and actually expression of working class solidarity and so on. It's kind of hard to see, will solar panels produce the same? Will wind farms produce the same forms of collective solidarity, particularly of a working class sort? And I leave that as an open question. But I do think that another element of the cultural is to try and connect these abstract discussions. And I think it's okay within the confines of the academy to talk in neoliberalism, decarbonisation, climate resilience, capitalism, that out there will have very little resonance, I think. And there is something about that cultural dimension is about how does this connect to people's, not just deepest emotions, but their everyday material practices and their lives. It's the question I used to always do when I was a politician. Ask my mother, who's a strong working class woman from North Dublin, and she said, what the hell does that mean, John? How is it going to make sense to ordinary people who may not have the interest, the time, the desire to understand the complexities? And the reality is, and I speak now fully as a recovering politician, when you're explaining, you're losing. The problem with the green and progressive movements is they're too cognitive. It's all in the head, and that lends itself then to technocratic, state-dominated, downward ways of understanding the transition, and not enough about the heart in terms of the emotional resonance or indeed the hands, the kind of stuff that Callum was talking about in terms of actual prefigurative practices now, which is going to make a difference to people's lives. But it's also culture, and Peter touched upon this, and many of us who are involved in the higher education business, you could say, there is a culture even within the academy. There's a culture within the arts sector and so on. The embedded ways in which the taken for granted, normalized ways of working. Where many of us in a more naive age 20 years ago would think nothing of hopping on a plane to San Francisco to give a 15-minute talk, guilty as charged. I mean, that was the normal way you do, academic business. So there's a culture in that sense of the normalization, naturalization of particular ways of acting and behaving. So on the one hand, I think it's great to have Ali here on the panel. I think culture can also be those very definite, expressive, explicit, this is culture. And then there's that mundane, everyday way in which we operate in terms of self-understandings and just getting on. And culture covers that whole gamut That's not particularly helpful to anyone who wants a nice, neat understanding of culture, but I think it's just such a fluid concept. It almost mirrors the ubiquity of energy hiding in plain sight. It's not just the oilscape, as Imre points out, we can't actually see. It's the same with energy. It's everywhere in terms of being ubiquitous and so on. And I do think, I'd like to point that, made here by Gavin in terms of myth. I actually think the mythic elements of culture is the meaning making and the story making. The problem with the climate challenge, as many of you probably know, it's a lovely quote from Mike Hume, who probably written, in my view, one of the best books anyway on the climate crisis, Why We Disagree About Climate Change. It's over 10 years old. And he has a lovely phrase in it which speaks to this issue of the narrative storytelling element. He says that the issue is not what we can do for the climate. That's the go-to technocratic, enlightenment, industrial, dare I say, male way. It's a problem, we're going to solve it. So it's not what we can do for the climate, it's actually reversing that. What can the climate do for us? In other words, what new stories can we tell in the disruptive, messy, as of yet, unplanned pathways out of this crisis that actually afford us new ways of living? Because the problem with the go-to technocratic, scientific, elite, expert-based, arguments, it's basically greening of business as usual. Do we want to make the transition from a private corporate-owned carbon system to a private corporate-owned renewable energy? That's what's on the cards. That's the dominant narrative, even in this university, that we can reform and slightly tinker around the edges and move to a greener, low-carbon version of an ecocidal, inequality, intersectionally unjust system. That's not for me. I think we can do better. And that's why I think Hume's point about that, the cultural affordances of responding to the climate crisis in terms of its meaning. Because ultimately my view is that the climate and the planetary crisis, yes, it's a crisis of a suboptimal and now very risky energy system based upon fossil fuels. Yes, it is also as a result of excessive globalization and the delinking of people and places. Yes, it's based upon an exploitative capitalist system, but ultimately it's a cultural crisis. I can see it's even ethical. That's not to rob this of the importance of political responses to it, but I think it goes much more than simply a scientific material issue. It actually is a deep issue in terms of our identity and the meaning making that we have available to us. And that's why for me, as another element of welcoming our discussion today, is to talk about, and a few people have done this already, the importance of imagination and creativity. You all know that famous phrase from Frederick Jameson, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? What has happened to our cultural imaginaries of trying to dream, whether it's in a prefigurative sense like Callum, or in a genuinely more utopian sense? And I think I'm with Oscar Wilde here, there's no point looking at a map unless utopia is on it. La vie marche vers l'utopie. That sense that it's almost, we have this cynicism which cauterizes any sense of an imagining, oh, you're being ridiculous, that's being too utopian. And even those of us in a professional sphere, I think we collude in not saying, you know what, the emperor has no clothes. This is a crock of shit. And yet we, for professional reasons, we don't want to step outside the groupthink. And that's why I do think an element of this idea of culture, of the mobilization of emotion and desire, maybe speaks to some of the other issues that we've had mentioned today, is the importance of having courage and leadership, of which we are in bad need of, particularly on this issue, to present a compelling, narratively rich, meaning-making response that isn't just a dry scientific, or indeed an apocalyptic, or indeed a techno-optimistic view. Because what I see at the moment in terms of this cultural crisis, because at the heart of the climate crisis, are two extremes. On the one hand, you have an apocalypticism, the too late is seen, never mind the Anthropocene, the too late is seen, it's too late, we're fucked. So what's the point? Let's just enjoy ourselves now while we go down. And we have to give credence to that, whether or not we do have the capacity to respond in time. And on the other hand, we have a techno-optimism where we outsource to, you know, technology scientists, brave entrepreneurs that moonlight as Iron Man, i.e. Elon Musk. In case you didn't know, that's what that Marvel creature represents, that brave entrepreneur hero that Ayn Rand would love it. But both of those narratives, as cultural tropes, the apocalyptic and the techno-optimistic, there is no agency for us. None. And that's why they are bereft of hope. Because hope, as I mentioned earlier, requires activism and agency. But I see that between these two extremes of techno-optimism and apocalypticism, the good stuff is somewhere in the middle, and that's what we've been kind of looking at today in terms of localised responses, prefigurative politics and so on, examples of whether it's repair cafes and so on, people rolling up their sleeves despite what the government may do, despite what we as academics may think or do, just getting on with it. And I do think there's something around that, when a call to arms, it is around that, is in terms of mobilising people's agency. But it also, as I mentioned earlier on in my introduction, we've got to mobilise people's anger. There's not enough anger in this whole issue. People should be furious, not just at abstract notions of injustice, but the everyday affronts, those micro affronts that afflict us, that we've often become so inured to it in our society. So I think it's about mobilising, and perhaps maybe this is a way of teeing up Imre, you may want to talk about this. Sometimes to win a fight you have to pick it. And sometimes you have to ratchet up the tension as opposed to playing the game by the rules. And there's something around that transgressive that I think the cultural is so important at. It's the reasons why before Marcuse died, Herbert Marcuse, the great, Frankfurt School theorist, he was always, it was an interesting, a posthumously published essay, is where he saw the ecology movement as an emancipatory movement along with the feminist movement. He didn't, deny that the working class and traditional socialist politics had a role, but he could see the ecology movement as defending life, or what he called, because he was a Freudian scholar as well, eros, that's life, against thanatos, which is death. That's the death instinct in Freud. It's where, channeling Marvel, Thanos. Again, you get a pop cultural education here today. So how do we defend life, eros, as against the death instinct? And of course, ergo, despite my difficulties with some of their tactics and thinking, the Extinction Rebellion movement is rebel for life. And that's what we're facing. We are ribbon-popping the life-supporting systems of the planet and calling it progress. So it is about how do we mobilise that sense of hope based on perhaps anger and injustice, but channeled in a progressive way, and this is where we have to be really careful. Because you can channel rage and so on in all sorts of horrible ways as well, and that's a danger perhaps there. But I can't see any other way around it in terms of how do we mobilise people's senses of injustice, anger, unfairness in a progressive way, and that's where we need leadership, we need a narrative that we're telling a story, just to finish, whereby we have to connect decarbonisation to decolonisation, as we mentioned already, not just in terms of what my colleague Peter Doran talks about, the decolonisation of our imaginary, away from the ways in which neoliberalism and what, the wonderful French Marxist Louis Althusser would call the ideological state apparatuses of the church, of the education system, of the media, which are constantly promoting to us a particular vision of how the world is and what the good life is. So how do we move beyond that in terms of decolonising our imaginary? And of course the other one then is that we have to face the legacies of imperialism, of which the island of Ireland, I think, has a very good case to say, because it was in Ireland that many of the early practices of colonisation were first tried out. That's not to make any necessarily political point, you can read that what you will, but I do think that the Field Day Collective, if people are interested, it was over in Derry many years ago, and looking at the connections between the colonised history of the island of Ireland with other places, subaltern colonised places, needs to be taken into account. Because I can't see what's happening now in one version of a post-carbon, if not post-capitalist future, is eco-imperialism. I'm really scared when I look at European Union plans for decarbonisation and the emphasis put on things like electric vehicles. Full disclosure, I own one. The mining of the rare earth metals that is involved in the production, the ecological and social injustices involved in this, to the extent that I think a lot of the debate about renewable energy should be properly seen as fossil fuel plus. We're not really seeing the ramping down of fossil fuels, it's adding extra energy on top of fossil. Even though we're, in simulatively or rhetorical terms, of course we're against more carbon energy, but actually the way we're going now is adding renewable energy on top of a fossil fuel base. So I do think the final thing I would say is that part of a cultural approach enables us to do something that I'm not really seeing much in public or academic debate. Maybe we should stop talking about fossil fuels and start talking about fossil resources. There's lots of other things we can do with these resources that don't involve burning them that's going to cause greenhouse gas emissions. What are we losing in terms of not mobilizing our intelligence, our technology, to use these resources in a different way that may actually help us in a just transition? Now, I'm not saying it means that we continue with North Sea oil exploration or coal mining in the way that we have done in the past, but I think, if nothing else, it would begin to open up the hand of friendship and understanding from an environmental perspective to fossil fuel working class workers, who often feel like they're being talked down to and at. Hence, you get a kind of right-wing populist backlash where the green agenda, the green issue, is seen as a woke, middle-class, educated, guilty middle-class issue, which has no connection to their lives. Because my big fear is not that we make the transition, but at what cost? I think the Gilets Jaunes movement was an example of what happens in an unjust transition. We want to bring everybody, whether it's whole of society like Senai, or at least the majority in our communities with us. We have to have these built in from the get-go. And to thank fossil fuel workers, to thank coal workers for all they have done for us, but to honestly say, we can't go back to the way it was before, but thank you for your service. And I think that's an exploited element of the just transition, is to actually be, courteous for the fossil fuel basis that created where we are at now. So here ended the secular sermon. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to invite Imre to address us. Imre will obviously follow with his keynote, so you might just want to begin to respond, but we'll have another 25 minutes then for conversation, and I look forward to all of your contributions. Thanks.
I hope to be short. So mine's in 3 parts. First part is, I'm just going to read to you a little bit of this year's ExxonMobil contested annual meeting. I guess it's a vote they send out to you if you're a shareholder of ExxonMobil, which I am. So this is when people who own shares put forward motions to contest something the board is doing. And what you get back from the board is the sheet that you vote on. You can either vote for, against, or abstain. But it also comes with recommendations from the board. So this is this year's. I have to vote before the end of day today, so I have to remember this. So, okay, point 4, independent chairman. Board recommendation, against. 5, special shareholder meetings. Board recommendation, against. 6, report on scenario analysis. Board recommendation, against. 7, report on environmental expenditures. Board recommendation, against. It's kind of tricky there. 8, report on political contributions. Board recommendation, against. 9, report on lobbying. Board recommendation, against. Report on climate lobbying. Board recommendation, against. So that's part 1. Part 2, I'm going to read to you a quote. It's not too long. It also uses his, so apologies. Motor power places gigantic forces at his disposal, which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Thanks to ships and aircraft, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. By means of spectacles, he corrects defects in the lens of his own eye. By means of the telescope, he sees into the far distance. And by means of the microscope, he overcomes the limit of visibility set by the structure of his retina. In the photographic camera, he has created an instrument which retains the fleeting visual impressions, just as a gramophone disc retains the equally fleeting auditory ones. Both are at bottom materializations of the power he possesses of recollection, his memory. With the help of the telephone, he can hear at distances which would be respected as unattainable even in a fairy tale. So this is a quote from Civilization and Its Discontents from Sigmund Freud in 1930. And he described this paragraph, or used this long paragraph, as a description of how humans have transformed themselves into what he calls a kind of prosthetic God. In 1930, or our use of energy today compared to 1930 is 7 times as much. So one way I often put it to my students when I read this out is, if we were once prosthetic gods already for Freud, if we were already these for Freud, what are we like now? As far as I know in Greek myth, I'm not an expert, I haven't read everything, there's a lot. I know of no god that has ever given up their powers. Okay. Point 3, third part. So I was at a lecture somebody was doing about bots in Twitter campaigns. The person's lecture was really about how bots are now making new bots through an AI process which can shield themselves from being discovered as bots. And this colleague, she was looking at 2 different movements as a way to kind of identify the role of bots in these movements. So they were both from 2017, the beginning of 2017. One is continuing on, the other isn't. The first one was the hashtag Women's March. It went along with the Women's March that followed immediately after the election of Donald Trump, I believe it was January 21st, 2017. And then she also looked at the hashtag Build the Wall, which perhaps you can obviously know what side that's on. She discovered that there were a lot of bots making the numbers of the Build the Wall bigger and bigger and bigger. And she found this troubling. I asked her if there were bots in the Women's March hashtag. She said that she only found some. And I asked her, why did the Women's March not use bots to increase their numbers? I guess the point I'm trying to make is the following. There are only, I will say, I will assert here strongly, I didn't think I was going to. I'm kind of riffing on things that were done today. If we're looking for examples of developments in the last 50 years that have fundamentally changed society, in which we might be able to use as examples of ways that we might do a lot of the work that I've been hearing here, there are 2 things I can point to. So one is social media, which I haven't heard mentioned here today. That has fundamentally reshaped the way that we live. It's changed information. It's mangled the ability to communicate with one another. It's created possibilities for community building. It's also destroyed them. Social media has to be a component of whatever is done with respect to the environment and with respect to energy. The second thing I think we could learn from, another fundamentally incredible, powerful, political, what can I say? I guess it's a movement that has had an impact that is like the impact I think we're asking for here, is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism as an extended project, starting from Hayek and moving forward. There is a process, an extended political process that went through. It was through think tanks, it was through religious communities, it was by lobbying government, it was by producing a common sense, which we are now all having to deal with and which is very hard to nudge aside. So I hear the word should a lot, and that's important for those of us who are doing this kind of research to do. It's kind of an idea of duty or obligation, something that is a demand. We have to make that. We have to make that. We don't have to ask for it. We have to create it. We have to create think tanks. We have to start lobbying. We have to make bots. Thanks.
Okay, so I'd like to invite you now to pose questions, make points as briefly as possible, and then we'll invite our panel to respond. Shall we take, we'll take maybe 2 or 3 at a time, and then we'll hand over to the panel to give you some responses. Who would like to?
So for the non-Irish friends here, there was a cultural revolution for a political revolution in Ireland. So what can we learn from the cultural revolution to inaugurate another terrible beauty such as 1916?
Okay. Shall we take another one? Go ahead.
This might be a similar question, I'm not sure. Just taking Callum's description of prefigurative politics and Ali's kind of discussion around arts policy, can we try and have a discussion about what kind of policy allows best for prefigurative practices in cultural production?
Right.
This might be a silly question, it's quite simple, but just Emery's suggestion of think tanks and lobbying and bots, but would that not all require a lot of money, therefore exclude a lot of the population from the movement?
Very good. Okay, so there we have. What can we learn from the history of cultural revolution on the island? What would it take to for the arts policy to actually enable a prefigurative politics, and the resourcing of think tanks and I suppose a critical mass of social media. Who would like to?
That side of the house.
Holly, why don't you come in first,
Okay.
and then we'll ask.
Well, I suppose I would probably, I'm not a historian, but I am from Cork, so I believe I can speak on revolutions in 1916 with some level of authority. I would question whether a cultural revolution was not actually a political act in itself. So there wasn't I would argue that all culture is political. So that's a view. I also would kind of suggest that maybe is it a revolution, or I would certainly be on the idea of actually kind of a form of strategizing, as was being suggested, might be a more effective thing. If we keep shouting and staging a revolution that involves getting angry, there's a different kind of anger. And certainly, I mentioned the CARE Collective. I don't know if any of you are familiar with it. It's certainly something that I've been kind of very interested in. Is a short book called The CARE Manifesto, written by 4 academics about 2 years ago, that in which they're proposing kind of radical care. So instead of radical anger and radicalism, they're talking about radical care and rethinking our relationship to household, to family, to how we define family and how we define our relationship of care to our economies, our societies, our families, our planets. To think about it in that way, in a slightly more holistic way. So I would come at this with kind of thinking about, when I mentioned ethics of care, kind of Toronto's idea, that there are different ways to be radical and angry, and they don't necessarily always involve going out and shouting. In terms of the arts policy question, in my experience, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, there are lots of questions to what is an arts policy in the first place, and the reason I deliberately chose cultural economy is that our question of what is art and what is culture has gotten very, very loose and is always contested. My most significant encountering of some of the challenges to this conversation today are that policy is very bound up in doing things increasingly as a result of neoliberalism in the idea of what are norms, what is the rationality in which these decisions are made, that are increasingly abstracted from the actual problem. I mean, Carol Bacci's work on kind of how do you identify the problem within policy in the first place. There's much more performative accountability than there is actual accountability, and that has increasingly constrained decision making. So the example I would give that's very close to home is when the MAC Art Centre was being built, what they wanted to do was establish a ground source heating system. and it was going to increase the cost of the building by a certain amount, and when they went through all their Green Book appraisals, it should have taken them through the most cost-effective solutions. They were told that this was not necessary, there was no business case to be made. Now, they said there was an environmental case, and they were turned down, and as a result they are now dealing with spiralling costs and reducing subsidy. So the idea of perpetuating a set of norms within policy decision making is actually the biggest challenge to changing cultural economy behaviours, in my view. And I would say, in a wider sense, you can see the same thing in community and social care and things like that.
Amy, would you like to come back? There's a consensus that the North has a radical lack, actually, of think tanks, that we don't have that kind of ecosystem within which to build a new narrative and a kind of agnostic sense. So, have you any thoughts or responses to those questions?
Sure. Ali said that what I was doing is suggesting strategy, and that's absolutely right. That would be a good way to summarize it. Bots are essentially free. You just need to write some code, be taught to do it yourself. The point is they make themselves, and they make a movement seem much bigger than it is. And that has incredible power all on its own. And it can do other kinds of work as well. It can mess up elections, and that's useful too. It just depends on who's doing the messing up. Think tanks are also not that expensive. You have a center here that's funded by government. It can do some things like hold this session. It can also act as a think tank by being connected up. This isn't a criticism, by the way, John, but it's just that there are things called this university that can have very different kinds of relationships to government, and it's already pre-funded. I'm starting a think tank, and anyone wants to join in on it. All it takes is a website. There are ways now to have certain kinds of presence and power that is very, very different than it might have been in the past. I don't need a building. I just kind of have to sell a vision. And that vision, I'm glad you raised myth today, Gary, because what that section of the Barth book is about is entirely about how poorly the left has been in developing a myth in relationship to the right. That book now is 50 years old. And I would suggest that this is the narrative that we have to have. I am in solidarity with everything that's been said here today. My question to every one of you, and to myself, as you'll see, is the question of how I can map a utopia for all of you. And we can have a discussion about whether it's good or bad or other, ridiculous, I guess, would be the other thing. But I want to know how I get from here to there. I think petitions are good. I think movements are excellent. I think demonstrations are great. These are also quite old practices for a very different kind of moment. They can be seen and they can be used through an image economy to seem quite ridiculous or pointless. So I suppose what I'm saying in terms of strategy is to take on what is necessary now, to see it as a long-term practice, unfortunately, given the demands of the environment, to be doing it in every crevice of the social, to not be doing it explicitly as the left. This happened. Neoliberalism did not just come into place on its own. This is the kind of strategy I can be suggesting. Think tanks take money, but there's something to be said about, broadly speaking, the left or the center-left occupying the academe. This is something that the right fears, precisely because all of that knowledge system can be turned against them if we decide to do so. So, yeah, I take your point. It's expensive. And we have great opportunities to do that. It does mean doing different kinds of work, perhaps, than we're doing now.
I think it's interesting. I was in the States a couple of weeks ago, and there was a poster by the freeway, and it was, "You can sleep soundly, there's no such thing as climate change." This was in Pennsylvania, and it's just incredible because it is this idea of getting beyond the mindset. And I think Callum was talking about the notion of ideology, where specific, partial things which are located in moments within history seem universal and unturnable. You know, they seem as if they can only be like things like wage labour, for example, has only been around for maybe 200 years, but we can't imagine the future without it. So it is, I don't know how this happens, because this is what Roland Barthes is talking about, this is what, you know, Marx is talking about in Fetish of the Commodities, this is what Herbert Marcuse is talking about in One-Dimensional Man. But it is about this idea of how you address this mindscape so that other alternatives seem possible and not remote and not daft or silly or utopian. You know, and that's an incredible paradox we find ourselves in, whereas, as has been clear today from the comments, we are in the process of destroying the planet, and yet that seems to be logical somehow, you know, and we can't get beyond the fact that that seems logical, or we can't get people to believe that seems logical. So it's an incredible kind of situation. So I think it's actually, I thought it was interesting to talk about bots, because I read recently that after one of the cyber hacks by Russia into Estonia, Estonia's counter to that was to introduce kind of ideas of misinformation education in primary schools and secondary schools. So everybody learned how to know about misinformation and disinformation. And I thought, that's genius. It really is. You know, that's where we all need to be, actually. You know, this needs to be an educational thing. It needs to start in the beginning. And it needs to take everybody with us. And, you know, somehow, you know, so.
The only comment I was going to make was, let's have a bit of Lenin. What has to be done? You know, that seems to be the issue, the issue of strategy. And I tend to probably agree with Ali in terms of, again, I'm not a historian of Ireland or Irish politics, but the Celtic Twilight and so on was part of the weft of what happened afterwards. And that's always been the issue with almost progressive politics for a long time. Why does the devil have the best tunes? You know, where is the positive cultural expressions beyond the slogans and the abstract theorising? And that's why I do think there's something in trying to combine in a strange way the anger that I spoke to in injustice and Ali's kindness is how can we hold our tender views in tough ways?
I would just qualify care, not kindness.
Sorry, care. Care. Or I would say kindness as well. Care. And it seems to me that, you know, just to go back to what Callum was saying, that the Black Panther movement, they were mobilised by anger and injustice, and yet they were also able to demonstrate care. And it does seem to me that you can't be what you can't see. I mean, part of the problem with leftist progressive politics is that it is, you know, hectoring, it can be shouty, it can be intellectually compelling, but then it's like, meh, okay, I'm going back to work now. You know, there's no material impact, and that's the idea of actually creating that which we want to see, even if it's in a micro sense. Because that is, certainly from my own experience on left-green politics, the amount of people who get burnt out because they struggled against the system for so long, and it's because it's this massive issue, nothing is happening, and then they get pissed off and leave. Whereas I'm not saying that a maker cafe or a repair cafe or a community garden is going to make the captains of industry presiding over global eco-cycle capitalism quake in their boots, but it's something that I definitely think has been missing, certainly on the left and progressives, is that material impact in the here and now before the revolution, as it were. And the other thing I'd say we missed out on, has been mentioned in Bridget's, is finance. But that's just a separate issue.
Okay. Mark?
So, in terms of think tanks, I think that in a UK context, the think tanks I think of as being successful, they tend to be right-leaning. They provide an evidence base for receptive right-wing politicians who often act and use that evidence base in their own self-interest. So how do you do that in a left-wing way? You know, how do you take, because the motivation for the people that will take the evidence that you are providing and the ideas that you're trying to put forward, will they be receptive to it, and will they be able to take it forward because they're not going to necessarily be acting in their own self-interest, they'll hopefully be acting in the interest of society.
I think won't speak long because I feel like other people are not going to, but I think that the word is strategic. So the first thing you do is you don't create a left think tank, you create a think tank. And that think tank will then speak to hear the Conservative Party in ways that might be interesting to them, and they might feel are to their advantage, but are not necessarily to their values. So it's something very strategic. It's something a little bit difficult to do, but less so than one might imagine. It's about articulating visions that those interested in your ideas think is positioning them for the future. It's that type of work. So the work is not to say there are left think tanks in Canada. They usually articulate left positions like the ones that are here today. They are tightly connected up with the academic system. So they might take a look at the decline of workers' real wages as a result of what's happening in the economy. Still very important. Some of them make in the newspaper, but they're already flagged in a certain kind of way. So I suppose what I'm suggesting, or just hearing about all of these ideas about reforming capitalism, is that is a slow process that involves banks, that involves the movement of money around. It's something to consider deeply, the mechanisms by which one changes a complex capitalist society. And those mechanisms are not quite the ones where we might analyze very effectively that we don't want this society. So then it requires a lot of just labor. And some of that involves not being straightforward. So if one, I'm just kind of suggesting, it didn't occur to me until actually Kim's talk. I was going to ask him, what can we learn from neoliberalism as a political practice in response to the New Deal, in response to post-war Keynesianism. It didn't go full out. It was a long-term project, and it was, and of course, it's already on the side of power and money. But it succeeds by not imagining that it gets to the finish line all at once. It elaborates its power very, very deeply. And it completely rolls back, at least in Western economies, the post-war consensus in relationship to labor. It's not, it will, you can write this down. I'm happy to say this will not be retrieved in 20 years based on voting. So can we learn something from neoliberalism? Other than that we don't like it or that it's bad. I suppose that's the idea, strategic.
Can we take another cluster of questions and points? I think we have time for one more.
Sure, thank you very much. Everybody's so interesting. We heard a lot about communities today. I was wondering what the panel's view is on how the business community can drive decarbonisation. I'm not talking about the macroeconomic level, I'm talking about the business community, the macroeconomic level.
Yes. Right at the back. Yeah. Yes.
Hi. I'd just like to bring something else in mind, something quite different, namely about dialectics of predictability and unpredictability. And this is partly related to our conference that John Doran and also Neve Small and some colleagues in Canada and India organized some time ago, which was very much centered on predictability versus unpredictability. I'm an anthropologist, I'm very interested in people on the ground. We all want people on the ground, but I'm interested in policy makers and all that, but how can we connect to the fears and hopes that people have in relation to predictability and unpredictability. Whereby both predictability and unpredictability can be positive and negative, of course. So if you want to hold on to what you have, then predictability is safe. If you see problems, you want change, and change itself can also be both hopeful and fearful. So if anyone has any comments on that.
Emer, would you say a couple of words about, we've got to see what this change looks like. You're involved in a project in Derry, and it's a manifestation really of some of these intersections that we're talking about.
Yeah, just to give a bit of background. The project is called Artitude, and it's how using the arts to change attitudes in relation to climate, culture and circularity. So at the moment, there has been a lot of conversation, and I'd say COP26 was talking a lot about climate action, and the focus would have been on heating and transport. But a big part of the conversation that was missed out was about retail and consumption and waste, and how there's a huge link between consumption and climate, and how actually, in terms of how we communicate at the moment, we're using, business terms or presentations or whatever else to do those conversations. But actually, how we should be using the arts and culture to talk and express things in a very different way, because people will take in information in very different ways. And maybe that's been part of the conversations that we need to expand and develop further. So that's hopefully gives a bit of background.
One more point before we move on.
I was just wondering, it kind of ties into a lot of today's talk, like what your thoughts are on direct action, the likes of the tariff signatures or Extinction Ready Initiative Britain. Because I feel like there's, within myself, a bit of like a psychological schism between business as usual, we're going to find a solution that's going to be okay, and no, we're not, Dan. We're in a very difficult situation. But for me to go with the second thought requires a huge amount of personal sacrifice, your career, paying your mortgage, all the rest. And the only thing that really snaps me out of it, and I would argue many people, is disruption. But the only way that I can get away with that is if it's enforced on me, and it's taken out of my hands that I made this choice. Does everyone get what I mean by that? And what do you think the role is of that? Because I think that's one of the biggest things that can impact our cultural change in terms of carbon, is ultimately being so disrupted in the harmful ways that we're living that we just can't do it anymore. So I just wonder your thoughts on the role of that sort of disruptive discourse.
Okay, so can I, just for your closing contributions, can I ask each of the panel members just to respond to some of those points? We've got everything from the role of business, the use of the arts, the dialectics of the unpredictable, and then the choice that we have around strategy.
Could I come back to Marishka's thing about predictability? I don't know whether this is of any relevance, but it connects with the question about micro-businesses. Mark Banks, who's written quite a lot about degrowth in cultural industries, I saw him give a paper, but he has a really kind of key piece of writing which is all about the creative industries and businesses and the fact that policies and structures could not cope with the unpredictability of them. So cultural businesses work differently to other kinds of businesses because they form alliances without necessarily there being contracts in place. They create sales arrangements without having any formal relationships. And this is, I think Paul Stapleton, who's in Sonic Arts Research Centre, has written about improvisational practices and how you can take ideas from jazz and apply them into business models, and to think about uncertainty as being a good thing. And I think that's something that we wrestle with, and that I think businesses wrestle with, because they go back to finding norms. We've all got very used to the idea of there being this thing called best practice or principles of work that are actually constraints to make us all produce more and more justification for why we exist. And then the other side of it is there was a paper produced last year, and I can't remember the person, which was about nostalgia and about looking at how some of the messaging around COVID safety and the rules were all built around predictability. They're built around a nostalgia for something that had never existed. Maybe it connects to myth, but that idea of kind of wanting to hold on to what we have is it that we never actually had it in the first place. We've just become convinced there is some golden past. And I think these things are kind of slightly connected, that we're trying to hang on to something, and some of the rules we are made to follow are about trying to create something that never was there in the first place, and that maybe we need to become more happier with unpredictability and find ways to help individuals feel more fluid about uncertainty.
I was going to say, the thing about business is that they're always trying to make a profit. You know, so the problem is that especially small and medium-sized enterprises, they can't think of, they don't have the space and time to think of alternatives. So I always thought that, you know, I mean, and then you've got places like this, which is dedicated to thinking about alternatives, and I always think that there should be more of an open door between business places and the opportunity to do research to find alternatives for business practice and what they can do and still make a profit. But, you know, obviously it's businesses are there, and there's a bottom line all the time. So I think if we could, you know, maybe there's a possibility of other agencies like universities being kind of more closely aligned with non-profitable or aspects of business, you know, that can make, you know, places more sustainable, or think of alternatives. Schools of architecture are full of alternative futures, and that's what we do. You know, every project we make is about an alternative future, and it just kind of feels as if, you know, if we had more engagement, then maybe we could, you know, other people could kind of share with that world as well, and we could obviously learn with them too. Yeah.
Maybe would you like to offer a few closing words?
Those are lots of interesting. There's too many distinctions between all of them. I think art is a different kind of vocabulary is important. I think the point that was made right away that it's not just a messaging system is absolutely essential. I don't know how that benefits into the political economy of art, but also business. So I think maybe I should come clean a little bit, which is that the reason that I got interested in energy at all is because of its fundamental, of certain energy systems, their fundamental importance to the social and its configuration, and the possibility right now that we're at this moment where that's cracking open a little bit. And I don't particularly care what the next energy system is. I'm interested in that cracking, as there's going to be some kind of transition. That seems to me to be a political opening that we might not have expected. And so whatever helps to make something different happen in that break, I'm happy to go with. So I've worked with various kinds of businesses. Profit is an interest, but there's other interests that business people have as well. I don't know what else somebody said.
Direct action.
It's a hard one. So I'll say, we can take it out. The dynamic you're describing is what's hard about it. It's absolutely what goes back and forth in anybody that's involved in it. So it's part of the dynamic of doing exactly that. And it's irresolvable, I hate to say.
The last word with John Doran.
Just to pick up Marushka's point, I will say something about business and direct action. I think the reality is that the Anthropocene, the current geological age we've now entered because of our use of fossil fuels, has already created a dynamically unstable world. And I think our systems of control and measurement can no longer capture that. I think we have to accept that. There is a sense in which the systems that have grown up and developed in a fossil fuel, you know, geologically and ecologically more stable age just can't cope with it, including our liberal democratic systems, by the way. So for me, to go back to the ancient Greeks, and this is partly speaking to those of us in the room who are educators, we need to cultivate virtues in the ancient Greek sense. That's what paideia, pedagogy, comes from. It's the cultivating of character that can respond appropriately in different, vastly dynamically changing contexts. So I do think there's something around, you know, cultivating those ways of responding and, you know, letting go. You know, part of the whole Enlightenment myth was based on control and domination and measurement and predictability. And of course, one of the epistemological features of ecology as a science, I mean, I hasten to say this with Professor Emerson in the room, who's a professor of biology, but ecology, as I always understood it, was unique. Now, it's not a predictive science in the same way that chemistry was, for example. It's only after the fact you can then find causal explanation. So there's something about, you know, seeing in that is the ecological element. This is Amanda's point, I suppose, the socio-eco imaginary, is that sense of letting go, that the future is of yet unwritten. There are multiple ways in which we can, you know, go into the future. And that's hard for me as an old Marxist, because I like dogmatism and certainty, and this is the way we're going to go. But I think that particular mode of thinking about transformation has perhaps run its course. We need to have this much more open-ended, fluid, including, as I mentioned at the moment, the reason why I'm hopeful is we have to allow the possibility of failure. There is no guarantee that we're going to win. In terms of businesses, I mean, even your most hardcore Marxists, when you ask them, as I often do with my students, what do you mean, anti-capitalism? And it usually is, they're not against mom and pop's stores. They're not against family-owned businesses that have been in their hometown for generations. It's always about big, evil corporations. And there's something in that, particularly despite the problems that SMEs have in access, and they're just too busy getting on. Why isn't there just one-stop shop to help, SMEs in this issue? But maybe, and this causes umbrage amongst my left colleagues and so on, is about making alliances with green versions of capital. Can these prefigurative spaces that Callum spoke about, can they be within businesses? And I know Angie's work, who's doing her PhD on that, can businesses themselves at least in part become these islands of post-growth business models, even though capitalism is still there as a macro system. But I would say that even with large corporations, and I'm surprised we don't get enough discussion on this, internally Walmart is a Soviet-style planned economy. Internally Google is a Soviet-style planned economy. These massive capitalist corporations internally are very non-capitalist, non-market based. So for me, that's always been a compelling argument for actually, no, a planned economy can work. Well, internally, these corporations can do it, so why are you telling me we can't do it as a society? And yet, it's amazing that it never really gets developed. So actually, the seeds of the destruction of capitalism may lie in corporations and how they're internally organised. Absolutely. Speaking as a recovering politician, which I've mentioned a few times, having been at the coalface in the molehills of power as a local councillor for 7 years, bourgeois liberal representative politics is fucked. It is absolutely unable to comprehend at the complexity, speed and scale what we need to do. It will take non-violent direct action, I think, to move anything. Think about it. Slavery didn't end because a nice bunch of Christians said, British government, please end slavery. Civil rights, the suffragettes, all requires social mobilisation. But I would say this though, I do like your point about you having permission. Oh listen, it's not my fault, it's them, Extinction Rebellion people forced me to do it. Those of us with privilege, and I'm looking at myself as a white, male, well-paid, tenured professor, where are we on this issue? It's not for those precariously employed or those who haven't got the choice. Now, what we do with that, if it's a think tank, as Imre says, we learn the lessons of the Montpellier Society and dig in for decades-long intellectual struggle. I'm up for that. Is it about going to speak to faith communities, as I often do, and say, well, what would Jesus drive? Where are you? Where are the trade union movements that I mentioned earlier? There's lots of old social movements that I think need to be involved in this conversation. But no, I'm absolutely convinced that people say there's a smell of the 1930s about the current moment, and I can't dispute that in terms of social division and the more than the whiff of fascism in the air. But there's also something that there's a sense in which we're coming to the end of something. But I think the end of capitalism and carbon and consumerism and patriarchy and all the other crap that many of us don't like, it will not be like a sudden death and a rebirth. It'll be more like a degenerative illness. Not a short, sharp shock and then we wake up into a bright new dawn. It's going to be much more difficult, and that's why I am with, I think, a consensus in the meeting so far that we've had, that there's going to be, different speeds at different levels. This isn't going to be an easy, smooth transition, and there will be 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and so on. That's not particularly maybe hopeful to say, but I think it's more realistic than thinking that there's just going to be a short, sharp shock and that's it, bada bing, bada boom, we're into something different. I don't think that's how the transition will happen. 30 years ago, when I was younger and had more hair and not a belly, that's how I did think, and it was wonderfully comforting. A bunch of capitalist bastards, the working class, a vanguard party, let's go to it. I no longer think that that's the mode of transformation that we're going to see. It is going to be much more messy, and as I said, I leave you with that rather troubling image that it's not going to be the death, it's going to be a degenerative illness. And then we see, well, will the patient recover, or will it mutate into something different?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I often say that the exhaustion of the earth has been accompanied by a discernible exhaustion of the dominant imaginary, and it's the exhaustion of our sense of inferiority. And out of that, I think we will begin to experience a new longing for something very different. Hoskins, the Transition Towns person, has talked about this longing, and I suppose shifting the register of the movement towards the mytho-poetic and the cultural, to give something very beautiful to look forward to. Thank you very much to our panellists. I'd like to invite you to thank them in the traditional